You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us.
Hello, and thank you for joining us here on Radio MMT as we spend the next little while taking our usual cheerful jaunt through the macroeconomy. I'm your host, Anne, and I am without Kev today. He is taking a well-earned break. But coming up this hour, I will be speaking with economist Dr. Stephen Hale about those interesting developments that are happening on the US front. As I just mentioned, we do look at macroeconomics, which is basically how nations' economies run. And often when you're looking at that, you end up discussing fiscal policy, which is how governments spend and tax, and monetary policy, which is how governments put a price on the money through interest rates. And both of these usually entail the operations of a central bank. So my understanding is that if you're going to have a monetary system, you're probably going to want to have a central bank. It's kind of like if you're going to have a healthcare system, you're probably going to want to have a hospital or two. And I feel like these libertarian economists that seem to be surrounding the Trump world, they look upon central banks the way someone might look at a hospital and say, hang on, there's all these sick people in hospitals. Hospitals must be making people sick. Therefore, we need to get rid of hospitals and we'll have a healthier population. So that's what makes me very curious about how this mandate of sorts, which was handed to Donald Trump on the 5th of November, 2024, when he won the presidential election, could they conceivably carry out some of their ideas that they have about what the US should do with its central bank? Is what they want even possible? Now, what do they want? And a clue to that is a policy document that is known as Project 2025. And by now, listeners might have heard of Project 2025. It got a bit of airtime in the run-up to the presidential election. And what that is, it's essentially one document in this agenda that is looking at reshaping the US federal government according to the right-wing ideals of this libertarian think tank known as the Heritage Foundation. Now, the Heritage Foundation has an annual income of about $100 million, which I'm assuming it garners from the odd billionaire and millionaire. And no doubt these donors will have high expectations that Trump will implement some of this manifesto, which was published in 2023. And if you'd like to read any of it for yourself, you can find it at www.project2025.org. Now, this 900-page document contains 30 essays in various policy areas. And according to CNN, at least 140 people connected with Project 2025 had worked in Trump's previous administration, although Donald Trump has repeatedly denied any formal links to Project 2025. even though back in 2018, the Heritage Foundation, the publisher of this thing, claimed that Trump had embraced nearly 2/3 of the policy recommendations which it covers. So, it's covering things like the mass deportation of undocumented immigrants, which we're hearing a lot about at the moment. It covers things like dismantling the public education system, defunding renewable energy, ramping up fracking. It's targeting journalists, and interestingly, it's looking at privatizing the weather service. And I'm just imagining if any journalist maybe dared to say that a severe weather event had something to do with the disruption to the global weather system, they might find themselves in a bit of hot water, so to speak. And Project 2025 also talks about purging the civil service to make it loyal to the president, which any good authoritarian leader would want to take that play, I imagine. For a really good expose of Project 2025, I recommend episode 3 of the podcast Lever Time. And that podcast was titled Project 2025 is Even More Radical Than You Think. And that was produced by Arjun Singh on the 5th of November 2024.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. Project 2025 is a policy manifesto released by the conservative think tank the Heritage Foundation, and it's over 900 pages long.
The core of Project 2025 really is personnel.
Alec McGillis is a reporter for the investigative news outlet ProPublica.
I think the Democrats did a very good job in recent months making it sound as if Project 2025 is all about policy. It is all about these radicalite proposals that are in that big book that they put out. But that book, The Mandate for Leadership, it's only one of the 4 parts of Project 2025. And the other 3 parts are really the more relevant ones because they're much more about personnel and how they're going to make sure that they can get enough true MAGA people in the federal government come next January.
He told me that one of Project 2025's most radical plans is one that's little discussed: Schedule F.
The idea with Schedule F is that you take tens of thousands of slots in the government that are now held by career employees, the ones that are what they call policy shaping, policy making slots, and you switch them to a new category called Schedule F, where quite simply they are much easier to fire. And the way that the Trump folks talk about it, and they're very candid about this, is that they don't really think they would need to fire 50,000 people. They would just need to fire a few thousand people to send the signal that if you do resist us, this is what's going to happen to you.
And this isn't just something born out of the MAGA movement. In one way, it's a culmination of the longtime goals of the Heritage Foundation to promote religious fundamentalism with a heaping dose of unrestrained free market capitalism.
The Heritage Foundation is the peak organization on the political right that has been working to move the Republican Party and American politics to the right since its creation in 1973. It has an enormous budget funded by many donors, and its vibe is a combination of plutocrat serving and Christian nationalists.
Nancy McLean is a historian and a professor of history and public policy at Duke University. In 2017, she wrote a book called Democracy in Chains: The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America.
And so what they're trying to do with Project 2025 is basically undermine the capacity of civil society to reject their agenda.
Nancy touched on another important thing that makes Heritage unique: the fact that it blends Christian nationalism with corporate hegemony. Today, it's usually taken for granted that the GOP is comfortably home to conservative Christians who also believe in free market capitalism. But that wasn't always the case. It's actually a fairly recent phenomenon.
I suppose the more important thing that I did was to try to bring together what is now known as the religious right. Those people were not active in politics, and I served as sort of a coach to get them active in the political process. And today, as you know, they're an important element in electing even the President of the United States.
This is the voice of Paul Weyrich, the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation.
Paul Weyrich is really, in many ways, the key architect of what was called for a long time the religious right, but now is really Christian nationalism that seeks to transform the entire federal government and to implant its own dogma as the law of the land. He was extremely shrewd about using particularly evangelical fundamentalist churches to build political power, not least because he understood that many of their, ministerial leaders were entrepreneurs themselves, kind of religious entrepreneurs. And they also had vast power because those kinds of congregations would pretty much do what their pastors tell them to do. So if you recruited the ministers to the, religious right, now Christian nationalist cause, you would get a huge section of voters. And we saw the power of that when 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump.
When Weyrich wanted to build a think tank that could rival liberal ones like the Brookings Institution, he needed funding. And that's why he partnered with Joe Coors, the grandson of the founder of the Coors Brewing Company, and a very wealthy man. By 1994, Heritage had become so influential, its ideas formed the basis of something called the Contract with America, a legislative platform and strategy that was a grocery list of right-wing goals, like cutting taxes, Social Security, and welfare. And for some of the wealthy donors to Heritage, like Charles Koch, these Christian voters were simply seen as tools to enact their radical economic agenda. Here's Nancy McLean again.
It's a very cynical pairing. I mean, certainly donors like, Charles Koch that I know best and many of the libertarians have never shown any sign of religious faith, but they do need foot soldiers to go to the polls to vote for the candidates that will get them the policies they want. And those policies, Arjun, are really extreme, like extreme, liberty to the point of anarchy for property holders, corporations, of course, fossil fuel corporations like Koch Industries, and then a kind of totalitarianism for the rest of us, where their freedom means our domination. But again, they know, and I believe this is my key finding in Democracy in Chains, they knew that the vast majority of the American people would never be persuaded to those views, would never come around to thinking that that was a good agenda for them. A country with no public education, no social security, no Medicare, no workers' rights, no environmental protections, no women's rights, etc. So they had to find, again, a source of votes to move this agenda. So again, it's an extremely cynical, almost, I think, diabolical at this point, turning to these Christian nationalist voters.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time.
So, Project 2025. With me on the line is economist Dr. Stephen Hale, Associate Professor at Torrens University, Australia. Welcome back to Radio MMT, Stephen.
Hello, Anne. Nice to be back.
Now, Stephen, I was hoping that you'd be able to answer some of the questions that rose in my mind when I was reading Chapter 24 of Project 2025, which is simply titled Federal Reserve. And of course, the Fed, as it is known, is the US version of a central bank. And it's slightly different from the one we have here because it's more of a layered system that includes 12 regional reserve banks. And then at the top of all those is a Federal Reserve Board of Governors. But what they seem to be saying in this Chapter 24 of Project 2025, it's very ironic to me that we do seem to agree with them that monetary policy is not effective, but I feel like we probably have very different views about whether or not to end the Fed, as they say. Do you have any immediate comments on that before we look at some of the details?
Well, I haven't read Chapter 24 or any of the chapters of Project 2025, and I don't intend to do so. There isn't the remotest chance of Donald Trump eliminating the US dollar. I suppose if he could get away with it, I could see him making the Federal Reserve or central banking functions a department of government, and taking direct control. I mean, that's the sort of thing that an authoritarian might do. It's also the sort of thing that someone who wasn't an authoritarian but had our view of the best way to run macroeconomic policy might do as well.
But before we get into the meat of it, I did want to have a look at some of the personalities that were orbiting this piece of writing. The chapter's author is Paul Winfrey. He's an economist who seems quite embedded at the Heritage Foundation. And he was a director of budget policy back in the 2017 Trump administration. And also, a buddy of his that he gave a shout out to was Judy Shelton. And she was former economic advisor in the 2017 Trump administration. And I don't remember this, but apparently Trump tried to get her onto the board of the Fed, but he failed to do so after 130 economists signed an open letter to reject her nomination. And I'm assuming these economists would have been mainstream folk, not heterodox economists like the MMT economists that we hang out with.
I imagine that they would have seen her as extremely unqualified. That doesn't mean that she's not going to end up on the board of the Federal Reserve or on the Open Markets Committee at some point this time around. They could do some crazy things. They're not going to abolish the US dollar.
Well, she is known for her advocacy for a return to the gold standard. And in fact, she was the director of the Sound Money Project at the Atlas Network. And maybe we can talk about the pros and cons of returning to a gold standard.
The US, it was on the gold standard between about 1870 and 1914, and then again after the First World War until 1933. The classical gold standard didn't come back after the Second World War. There was a sort of gold standard under the Bretton Woods system after the Second World War, but there was only foreign central banks and governments that could convert the US dollar into gold at a fixed price. And of course, that eventually was abandoned because the US started to run out of gold reserves. There's no particular reason why they couldn't go back on some form of gold standard again. It would just mean fixing the exchange rate between the US dollar and gold. If you fix it with too high a value for the US dollar, then the US would run out of gold reserves again and go off the gold standard once more. It would also collapse if there were some rules limiting the issuance of US dollars to the stock of gold reserves, like the earlier classical gold standard, the first time there was a major crisis like a pandemic. So I don't think that it would last very long unless other countries also went onto it. Basically, it's a full employment policy for gold.
Well,
I mean, you're not offering to buy any unemployed labour at a fixed price, which is what a job guarantee is. You're fixing a price of gold and saying you're prepared to buy as much gold as the world wants to sell it.
yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
In their idea of a gold standard, banks would issue liabilities denominated in dollars and backed by a valuable commodity such as gold, and competition would keep banks from overprinting or lending irresponsibly, because any bank that issues more paper than it has assets available would be liable to a bank run. That's a very odd way of saying, oh, you're going to stabilize your economic system by invoking this instability of bank runs.
So actually, what you want to do is you want to go back to the days of bank runs and frequent banking crises of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And they had something like that in the days before there was a Federal Reserve, and it was not a recipe for stability.
No, I can't imagine.
It was a recipe for wild swings in banking and the absence of safety nets and depressions every 10 years. And I simply don't believe that the Trump administration will go down that route.
They are correct, aren't they, that when you go on a gold standard, that is a way of limiting how much the federal government can spend. And that's what they're aiming to do, I think, is try and put a limit on federal government spending.
Not directly, it limits currency issuance. In principle, anyway, it exposes the government eventually to a risk of insolvency in a crisis. But of course, that wouldn't happen. They'd just go off gold again, which is exactly what happened in both world wars and then again in August 1971.
So what we could say is gold standards do inevitably break down, but it doesn't destroy your monetary system when that happens.
No, you improve the monetary system. You move to a pure fiat monetary system. There are lots of things that made the gold standard at the end of the 19th century last as long as it did. When I say as long as it did, it lasted for about 45 years. If that's a very long time. It doesn't seem a long time to me now in my 60s, but it lasted for about 45 years. As the world economy was growing, as international trade was growing, it just happened to be the case that discoveries of gold and the availability of gold increased in line with the demand for liquidity, so that the supply of the major currencies could increase in line with the demand for those currencies around the world while continuing to obey the rules of the gold standard. There was relatively balanced international trade in that Britain ran a deficit with countries like the US, but ran a surplus with its own empire. So that sort of kept the international financial system ticking over. That having been said, in those days when the US didn't have a central bank, there were regular banking crises every 10 years or so, regular depressions, periods of mass unemployment. Although the price level didn't rise over time, it wasn't a stable price level. Instead, sometimes they had rising prices, sometimes they had catastrophically falling prices. It wasn't actually a period of very rapid economic growth either, compared to the period after the Second World War. So I'm not sure why they romanticize it the way they do. Tying your currency to a primitive metal is not really something that anybody sane should be suggesting. I mean, they could do it. It would eventually break down. It's like a number of crazy ideas like free banking. They'd be catastrophic almost immediately, and they won't happen.
Well, that's the good news here. We don't have to be worried that these how much.
I'll tell you what we need to be worried about. We need to be worried about Donald Trump rolling back on anything the previous administration was saying or doing about climate change and renewable energy,
Yes.
and pumping as much gas and oil as he can to keep energy cheap, and pushing to a point where by the end of his presidency, catastrophic climate change is almost baked in. That's what we need to worry about. Worrying about foolish ideas to do with reforming or abolishing the Fed and leading sooner or later to financial crisis of Minsky proportions. Those kind of ideas, boom and bust ideas that might come from Donald Trump, well, we can survive them and we could put it right later on.
Mm-hmm.
The climate policy of the Trump administration has the potential to drive us into a mass extinction.
Right. So this will be the conversation, Stephen, of what not to worry about.
I worry about it a bit,
Uh-huh.
but it's not. They're not going to do anything that you couldn't reverse
Right.
on the financial
Right.
side.
Well, I have to say, That sounds to me like using your MMT lens to clarify what your worrying list really ought to be.
Well, you know why I'm not so concerned about some of the more extreme statements in Project 2025 about money and banking? It's that Donald Trump is not a libertarian.
Oh,
A fascist is not a libertarian.
okay.
Quite the opposite, in fact. Donald Trump wants to centralize power.
Hmm.
He doesn't want to eliminate the power of Donald Trump.
Right.
There is a contradiction there between being a libertarian that doesn't want the central government to have any power and being an authoritarian who wants to centralize power, not in existing institutions, but in the presidency, and then potentially would want to actually hang on to the presidency beyond his 4-year term.
Radio MMT.
On 3CR,
Between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m.
the second and fourth Friday of each month.
Radio MMT. If you like our show, subscribe to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
And you can find us through your favourite podcaster and give us lots of stars.
And or give us a like on Facebook, Twitter or YouTube.
Your support really helps.
Because if you're not liked on social media, you don't exist.
I might just go back to the problem as they see it, which is what they say is a core problem with government control of monetary policy is its exposure to two unavoidable political pressures. One is the pressure to print money to subsidise government deficits, which we could say something about that. And then the other is the pressure to print money to boost the economy artificially until the next election. They say both will always exist with self-interested politicians, and the only permanent remedy is to take the monetary steering wheel out of the Federal Reserve's hands and return it to the people. And so they have three solutions of what that might look like. And they're not saying let's do all three. What they're saying is our preferred solution is this thing called free banking. If we can't do that, then we'll go for commodity money. And if we can't do that, then we'll go for this monetary policy rule.
Why would Donald Trump do any of these things? He loves deficits.
Economist Dr. Stephen Hale.
When he was last president,
Yes.
he sort of half understood little bits of modern monetary theory. I mean, he was one who was saying we're not going to run out of dollars.
Mm.
Don't worry about the tax cuts that I'm giving, pushing the deficit up. The Democrats were, at the time, were talking about the impact of that on the deficit and how disastrous it would be. And people like me and Stephanie Kelton were saying, the tax cuts for the rich are terrible, dreadful, entrenching privilege in a country which already has massive inequality and is controlled by a narrow elite, making it even worse. But the one thing you don't have to worry about is the US government going insolvent. Of course it's not. And tax cuts for rich people are not even particularly inflationary because they don't spend all that much.
What you seem to be saying, Stephen, is that the authors of this particular chapter might be in for a bit of disappointment. The free banking idea, I'm just noticing they're saying here that the Federal Reserve is effectively abolished and the Department of the Treasury largely limits itself to handling the government's money. So what I see them saying is that they want to fold the Federal Reserve operations or the central bank's operations into the Department of Treasury.
Terrific.
Exactly.
I'm in favour of that. There's nothing wrong with that. But what do they think the government's money is going to be, though? Are they talking about abolishing the US dollar? I mean, how does that work?
No, I don't think so. I think they're quite happy to keep the dollar going.
So we still have a monetary system. The US government is still the issuer of the US dollar.
Right. You know, I'm glad you said that you agree with it because I've I don't know. I feel like I'm going in and out of focus when I read this, because every now and then I go, yes, do this. And so I find myself agreeing with the crazy libertarian.
But they don't understand, do they? Because that's not going to stop the government spending.
No.
That doesn't stop the government being the currency issuer. It just means that instead of having a notionally independent, I don't like to call it privately owned, because it's more like a sort of private club. And actually the federal government has effectively the rights of ownership, because the profits of the Fed nearly all go to the federal government, and the chair of the Federal Reserve is appointed by the president and Congress. But technically, the Federal Reserve is not owned by the government. So what you'd be doing is you'd basically be making the Federal Reserve owned by the government, because you'd be incorporating it in the Treasury, which is the opposite of what they wanted to do. So I don't really think, I mean, I haven't read what they're writing, so there may be some logic to it. But if they want to take central banking functions and locate them in the Treasury, well, that's exactly where they should be located.
And why do you say that? Why does MMT say that we should really just fold the RBA back into the Treasury in Australia?
It's not something that I have a strong opinion on. I don't believe central banks are independent of the federal government anyway.
Unlike Jim Chalmers, who's all about the independence of the central bank.
All right, let's go to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. He's responding after rates remain on hold after the RBA cash rate decision.
I don't preempt and I don't second-guess decisions taken by the Independent Reserve Bank, but these decisions are taken independently by the Reserve Bank. My efforts have been about trying to make the bank more independent, not less independent. I respect and cherish its independence. The Coalition and the Greens are as one when it comes to doing the wrong thing about the Independent Reserve Bank.
Well, of course, legally, it's not independent of the federal government. And even if he was foolish enough to remove the power of the Prime Minister to, in extremis, overrule the governor of the RBA, which is what the RBA review recommended, you just need to pass another law to reverse it. So the RBA operates under a charter which is legislated by politicians. Of course, it's not independent of the federal government. We don't need to make major changes to our institutions, but I'm just saying that if Project 2025 and Donald Trump thought it would be a great idea to take the main functions of the Federal Reserve and put them into a federal government department, then that's not something that we'd complain about.
No, I didn't think so.
If we want to have a civilized society, and if we want to stabilize an unstable economy, then we do need what Hyman Minsky called big government. We need a government which is spending at least 25%, perhaps much more than that, of gross domestic product. And not all spending will be ideal and wise, but then it is the job of politicians, it's the job of people outside politics, and it's the job of the populace generally to monitor what politicians are doing, and if we don't like what they're doing or we think it's irresponsible, to replace them with someone else.
I was going to say the third possible solution was a monetary policy rule known as the K% rule, which was proposed by Milton Friedman back in 1960.
Well, Milton Friedman didn't understand banking. We know that central banks, or whoever is performing the functions of a central bank, cannot control precisely the rate of growth of the supply of money in the economy. That depends in part on the needs of the private sector. People demand credit. Banks create credit. When they create credit, they create money because bank deposit liabilities are part of the money supply. And there's no evidence that central banks can control what people usually regard as the money supply, which is an aggregate dominated by deposits at private banks. Central banks, in principle, could control the supply of currency, which is physical currency plus bank reserves at the central bank, because, of course, that's the central bank's liabilities. But if you were to do that, then if you want to control the supply of reserves, you lose control of overnight interest rates, because if there's a demand for additional reserves and you don't meet that demand, interest rates go up. If there are surplus reserves in the system, then overnight interest rates go down. So Milton Friedman's recommendations to control what is usually called the monetary base was tried out very, very briefly at the end of the 1970s by the Fed, and it led to catastrophic fluctuations in US interest rates. Interest rates became very unstable. It didn't allow the Federal Reserve to control more effectively the amount of lending that private banks were doing, so the money supply, and it was abandoned by 1982. And such experiments have been tried out once or twice around the world in the intervening years, including briefly in the middle of 2013 by the Bank of China as a result of some Chinese economists having done PhDs in the US at places like Chicago. But it was abandoned almost immediately because, again, money market interest rates, overnight interest rates became very volatile. There would have been a banking crisis, and so they abandoned it.
Yep. So even if they do try it out, it won't last for very long.
I don't even think they know what they're recommending. I don't think they understand how the banking system works. They certainly don't understand how modern monetary systems work. And Milton Friedman didn't. You can offend people when you tell them this, but it's true. Milton Friedman did not understand banking.
I'm James Juniper. I'm an economist at the University of Newcastle, and you're listening to Radio 3CR.
They have a whole bunch of recommendations for improving what they call monetary policy outcomes. And one of those recommendations was stop paying interest on excess reserves. And I found myself in somewhat agreement, but then their reasoning was this, which is that the Federal Reserve effectively prints money, then borrows it back from banks rather than those banks lending money to the public. This amounts to a transfer to Wall Street at the expense of the American public. So they seem to think that the government's borrowing money and then using taxpayer money to pay for the borrowing.
They've got no idea what money is, have they? All money is debt.
Economist Dr. Stephen Hale.
Yes, we're in favour of eliminating interest on bank reserves, but that's because we're in favour, at least most MMT economists are in favour of a zero, or at least very close to zero, permanent risk-free interest rate in the economy, and using other mechanisms to manage total spending and inflation risk in the economy generally, including tighter regulation of the types of lending banks can do, the collateral that they can lend against.
This is your macroprudential regulation,
That's
isn't it?
right. Yes, of course. We have a different view of the management of inflation. We also have a different view of how effective it is when you try and manage inflation by nudging interest rates up or down. We don't believe, and there's good evidence of this, that there is a reliable, predictable link from changes in the official interest rate to spending in the economy to the price level. So if you don't want to be paying interest on excess reserves, well, don't pay interest on reserves and have a permanently zero federal funds rate or cash rate, as is the case in Australia, and manage inflation risk using other mechanisms. Now, the country that would be the best country in the world to lead us towards permanently zero official interest rates would be the US.
Mm.
If you're Australia and you do it on your own, everybody goes, well, if we were to do that on our own, there might be implications for the foreign exchange market, and that might push up the cost of imports and potentially lead to cost push inflation. But if it's the US doing that kind of thing, the US is much less exposed to those kind of pressures than the rest of the world. I would like all the world's major central banks to move towards, if not zero, close to zero official interest rates, and to stop manipulating official interest rates to try and manage the economy. We don't believe it's effective. We think fiscal policy is much more important when it comes to influencing total spending. And you know who else it would help?
Do tell.
We've just had the discussions at COP29 about climate finance. And the background to that is that after the pandemic, where, of course, monetary sovereign governments like the US and Australia had no problems running big deficits and supporting their economies and recovering quickly from the pandemic, that was not the case for low and middle income countries in Africa and elsewhere, where they were not able to run such big fiscal deficits and where they rapidly ran into problems in funding the interest payments in their US dollar debt. And those problems were made worse when the US started to increase its interest rates, because the interest rate that a developing country has to pay on new issues of US dollar denominated bonds depends on the degree of risk aversion out there around the world, which increased, but it also depends on US official interest rates too. So increases in US interest rates, and this is what happened in the early 80s when US rates quadrupled, can trigger a developing country debt crisis and force countries into cutting back on investments in food sovereignty, education, health, transportation, public services generally. And that's another reason why it would be great if, not just in the US, but in the US, the Eurozone, Japan, China, the UK, and elsewhere, if official interest rates were close to zero permanently. It would assist low-income developing countries, particularly when it came to the burden of servicing their foreign currency denominated debt, which is the biggest hurdle in their way of sustainable development.
Did you happen to see Stephanie Kelton's article in her Substack called The Lens? And this article was how to cut $2 trillion in federal spending without breaking a sweat.
I did. Of course, she was responding to Elon Musk and Vivek, what's his name?
Ramaswamy.
That's right, that Donald Trump was put in charge of slashing government. Absolutely. And that's the Warren Mosler point.
Which is?
Well, if you put interest rates up, it increases the transfer from the federal government to the private sector. If you want to cut government spending, the easiest form of government spending to cut over time would be, bearing in mind that the government central bank sets the interest rate, would be just to set the interest rate at zero. There's an argument you wouldn't need to issue treasury bonds anymore.
Right.
In that case, you could just leave the reserves in the banking system. It doesn't mean other interest rates would be zero. Private sector interest rates would reflect risk and collateral and competition and marketing objectives. So it doesn't mean mortgage rates would be zero, although, of course, they'd be permanently relatively low. But the default risk-free interest rate in the economy would be permanently at zero, and the government wouldn't be paying interest on its bonds. And then we wouldn't have to put up with this nonsense where people say, oh, the US government is paying X billion dollars of interest, and let's compare that with what it's spending on education or on health, as though it's one or the other.
Speaking of the interest rates throughout the whole economy. I have heard people question, well, what would then be the base rate so that capitalism can price risk? For example, if you're a company and you have $1 million, if you can just stick that in a bank and get 5% interest, you know that if you're going to do anything else with that money, you have to earn more than 5%. So how would you manage that signal?
Well, you just replace the 5 with a 0.
Oh.
If you're not taking a risk, you wouldn't be getting any interest. If you are taking a risk, you'd be getting a risk premium above 0. I mean, it's not stopped capitalism working in Japan, having basically 0 interest rates for the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
We do not believe in the use of manipulating interest rates in order to try and manage the economy. We believe that the official rate of interest should be left stable over time. Actually, when Britain was at the height of its industrial power, the bank rate in the UK was at 5%, but it wasn't changed for over 100 years. The official interest rate in England remained the same in the late 18th and early 19th centuries for over 100 years. There's no reason why we couldn't have an official interest rate which remained stable and that we could not use other mechanisms, fiscal policy, automatic stabilizers, job guarantee, tighter banking regulation and regulation of finance in order to manage total spending in the economy and to manage inflationary pressures relating to total spending. And most MMT economists agree with that. We really should have learnt by now that the way the conventional narrative talks about central banks managing interest rates in order to stabilize the economy and to achieve an inflation target is ineffective. It doesn't work. Since it doesn't work, well, we may as well have stable interest rates, and you may as well set those stable interest rates at 0 or close to 0, which is pretty much what Keynes was saying in the general theory 1936, and 90 years later nearly, we really should have caught on.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
Another thing, I mean, there's multiple amazing things in this chapter 24, but one of them, they keep talking about winding down the Federal Reserve's balance sheet.
They're doing that already, or they have been.
Okay.
Central banks have been reducing the size of their balance sheets, well, since early in 2022.
Okay.
They stopped doing that in the US, or at least they slowed it down from about a year ago because it was causing a few problems. The reason why it was causing a few problems was that international banking regulation in the last few years has required banks to hold more liquid assets than before. And consequently, what was happening was that banks were becoming reluctant to lend reserves overnight in the US about a year ago. So the Fed stopped shrinking its balance sheet. In this country, in Australia, the Reserve Bank's balance sheet has shrunk by about a quarter since the height that it had in early 2022. So central banks are shrinking their balance sheets
Anyway,
post-pandemic.
So my understanding is like a balance sheet is basically just a list that you keep of your assets and another list of your liabilities. And then what they're saying is if you're shrinking your balance sheet, you're decreasing what? Both sides?
You're decreasing both your assets and your liabilities, yes. And in the case of the RBA over the next few years, as Treasury bonds mature, then the RBA's assets will shrink because it'll have fewer Treasury bonds. the RBA's liabilities will shrink initially because the official public account will be debited to match those maturing Treasury bonds.
So we're talking about lots of numbers being changed in spreadsheets.
Yes, that's all.
What they're saying in this chapter 24 is they want to see the Federal Reserve's balance sheet wound down to what historically existed before the 2008 global financial crisis. And they don't like the fact that the Federal Reserve has $2.6 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities on its balance sheet. So I guess what I'm kind of wondering is if they manage to put in these limits, would that then tie the hands of what the federal government can do in the face of something like a GFC?
No, because the federal government is the institution imposing these limits, and it could instantaneously remove the limits again.
All right, so they can kind of have them there in theory, but
especially when you're controlling both houses of Congress and the presidency, you can do anything.
Right. Yeah, you're sort of helping me to see that I don't need to take it any more seriously than I was.
Well, I don't know. These people are crazy. They could do some crazy things, but some of the crazy things would collapse straight away. Other crazy things, if they did them, could quickly be reversed. And going back to the first point, the craziest thing they're going to do is drive us off a climate cliff.
Exactly. Well, I appreciate, Stephen, that you indulged me in looking at this topical issue of what we can expect from the change in regime over in the United States. And I do feel that you are an oasis of a sanity when it comes to understanding what we really need to worry about.
It's nice of you to say that. I don't feel like an oasis of understanding, but thank you.
Well, you offer an oasis to the rest of us, and you do that through Modern Money Lab. And I do know that you've got an event coming up here in Melbourne, Saturday the 7th of December and Sunday the 8th of December from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. each day at the Torrens University Flinders Street campus in Melbourne. So can you tell us about what you've got planned there and what people could expect if they join you in that?
Well, we've done a previous weekend workshop. It was called Rethinking Capitalism, that covered all sorts of things like ecological economics. And we talked about inequality, and we talked about trade policy. And we did a little bit of MMT too. And I've done that now 15 times, that weekend workshop. Around Australia, we've done it twice, if not 3 times, in Melbourne. The next workshop that we're going to try out for the first time in Melbourne, it's going to be a whole weekend on modern monetary theory. We're going to talk about the nature of money. We're going to talk about central banking, an MMT view of how central banks ought to function. We're going to talk about budgeting and why we think that that's been wrong and has imposed costs on society, and how we think it should be done. We're going to think about inflation, so we're going to contrast the conventional view to our view of inflation and inflation risk and the best way of managing inflation. That's going to be influenced by thinking about how businesses set prices and what caused the upward pressure in the price level.
What I love about inflation, it's not what you think. So you really need to go to a workshop to hear about this.
That's right. And we'll talk about exchange rates, but I'm also going to talk about the developing countries, especially low-income developing countries, and why the governments of those countries have a more difficult job of it than the government of a country like Australia. And we might think about the recent COP29 climate finance deal and what our friend Fadel Kaboub, the MMT economist who was there, had to say about it. It's going to work the same way that the previous weekends did, in the sense that I'll talk for about half an hour and then we'll have discussion groups. I'm just going to see how it goes. If it goes well in Melbourne, well, we've already said we're going to do it in Sydney in January, and we'll tour around Australia. And we did the previous thing in New Zealand. We'll probably do this in New Zealand.
Right.
I've got a standing invitation if I ever get back there to Vermont.
Oh, have you?
to go into Bernie Sanders land and do something like this over there.
Mm-hmm.
My challenge is to put something together which is accessible without being dumbed down to people who don't have a background.
Right. So you don't need to have an economics degree.
And I would invite anyone who's interested to come along, even if you've got a very negative view. And there might be one or two listeners.
You want a heckler or two in the audience?
I'm more than happy to have people that disagree with us. The last thing I want is people coming along thinking that I'm going to be the fountain of wisdom and all they have to do is absorb it like a sponge. I'd much rather people come along and challenge.
Come with your questions.
Absolutely right.
Well, Stephen, it's been great chatting with you again, and I appreciate all the work you do at Modern Money Lab, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gum Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to, form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.